Carmine Infantino, and to a much greater extent, Neil Adams were our guests at the, I think, second and third conventions, that these, even though Jack was living out here, these guys went back to New York. This was back when the business was still in New York, and they told people it was okay. And then suddenly, freelancers realized, holy shit, I can take a tax-deductible vacation and bring my family to the best tourist town in America. And suddenly, we had tons of people coming in.
I'll tell you, there was a fellow at the first San Diego Con. I don't know how many people in the room were at the very first San Diego Con?
You got
The Davis, thank you. There was a guy who worked kind of like an unpaid intern for DC Comics named Mark Hannerfeld. Mark Hannerfeld was publishing the Comic Reader at the time, which was the big fanzine. He's the guy they based the character Abel in House of Secrets on. He looked like Al Hurt. And he was a sweet, lovable guy who loved comics and really didn't do anything. He didn't write or draw, but he wanted to be in comics badly. And he hung around the DC office and did work for them without pay. He just showed up and said, let me do stuff. And he heard about this convention in San Diego, and he said, DC Comics should send a representative to it. This is before the first San Diego Con. And Carmine Infantino was the publisher, I think he's the executive editorial director at the time, said, fine, you go. You spend your money, you go. And Mark, on his own dime, came to the convention as the representative of DC Comics. And they had given him a few stats of upcoming stories to show. And he got to the convention and he went around. He was the East Coast presence at the convention. He was representing not just DC Comics, the entire East Coast industry. They had this, on Saturday of the convention, this is down in the lower confines of the U.S. Grand, I think it was at 2 o'clock, Jack Kirby gave his talk, which was the big event of the entire convention. And I was told I was going to introduce him. And I go, oh, and I'd never really spoken in front of a group, and I had very little, so people didn't know who I was, and I was very nervous about this. And just before it was about to happen, Shell comes up to Jack and says, you want me to introduce you? And Jack says, points to me and goes, no, Mark's going to introduce me. And the next thing I know, Mark Hannerfeld's on stage. Shell went over to Mark Hannerfeld and said, oh, you go up and introduce Jack. And Mark goes, okay. I look up and Mark Hannerfeld's introducing Jack. And I said, fine, I'm off the hook. I don't have to do this. And while he was up there, Mark made this little pitch about, he made a little 3-4 minute speech about DC Comics. I think there's a recording of this on the Comic-Con Memories, right. And then Mark is the guy who went back to New York, or after the first one, and told Neil Adams and told Carmine and told all those guys, you got to come out to this thing. This is going to be very big. And then as Scott said, then Carmine discovered he could come out and charge it to the company. And Neil discovered he could come out and sell sketches and make a lot of money. And pretty soon we had the whole East Coast industry was coming out.
Well, Carmine was on the company payroll, so he not only came out dressed as a gangster and had a hired escort with him who he got mad at because she was much more interested in reading Young Lust comics.
Carmine came to the one at the Sheraton Harbor Island Inn. Carmine came out and checked into like the presidential suite and billed it to the convention. And Shell came to me in a panic and he said, you got to talk to Carmine and tell him you can't stay in that room. We can't pay for that room. And I said, you go talk to Carmine and tell him you can't pay. And finally they convinced Carmine that DC Comics could pay for the room he was in. They moved to a cheaper room and billed that to DC Comics. But the fact that Carmine, that president of DC Comics, the guy with hiring capability, was out here talking about looking for artists and such, that made a world of difference.
By the way, here's a flyer for the first Comic-Con with Scott Shaw artwork on it. And it says, meet guest of honor Jack Kirby, award-winning cartoonist, plus special guest science fiction pros Ray Bradbury and A.E. Van Vogt. And there's like an entire letter on the back saying, we're going to put on this convention, and we're going to have all these things there, and we're going to have Marvel Mania International. We'll have a special display in the Huckster room.
We never showed up.
So, and then for the mini-con, the first one that was one day, this is the flyer for that. And it has the program on the back.
And it says Marvel Mania on the front, and we weren't there either.
And then this is the program that was given out to everybody.
What time was Jack's talk? Is it on there?
Let's see.
Tickets, by the way, were $3.50.
That's
for
the
whole
mini
3
con.
days.
Yeah, this is the mini
The
con.
first con.
This is for the mini con
Oh,
too.
okay.
Your cover there is actually missing the actual cover, and we didn't have money to actually put a cover on the Minicon program book, but the local convention and visitors bureau gave us these pre-printed ones that showed like a museum of man.
Yes, I
on
have
it,
that.
and Don Diego was printed on it. We had Don Diego badges, and so that was actually the cover of our Minicon program.
And then this was the program book for the very first show with a Jack Kirby wraparound cover. So this might have Jack's time.
That's why we have a wraparound cover.
In fact, I think it's right in the middle.
This program book also had in it the very first time that Jack's New Gods for Mr. Miracle characters were ever seen.
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. Yeah, I remember it. Saturday, 2 o'clock. And in there, that DC had sent, Mark Hannerfeld had sent drawings of the new. This is August. What's the date? Was it August or July of
August.
August.
And
of
it's
the
weird, it was a
1970s.
Saturday, Sunday, Monday.
Yeah, and the New Gods for Every People didn't come out till December of that year. This was the first time characters were ever in print.
So, David, you actually wrote about one of our first 2 guests at our Minicon. We had 2 guests. We had Mike Royer, who was at the time, I think, inking Tarzan for Russ Manning. Is that correct? He was doing that. And also we had another very famous guest, and who was very good to us in the very beginning and supported Comic-Con throughout the years, and you wrote about him for the program. Would you like to say a little bit about him?
Forrest J. Ackerman, fan extraordinaire, editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland, and just for Famous Monsters alone, his influence on the imaginative field is tremendous. In researching the piece on Forey for the program book, I Googled around and I found a thing from his own, one of the social media page, and his own estimation of the top thing was the creator and editor of Famous Monsters. And in his role as the editor of Famous Monsters, of course, he had his home, the Acker Mansion, and it was a big deal for fans, not just in Southern California, but really all over the country, to go to LA and visit the Acker Mansion. Well, Forey was invited and said yes and came to San Diego, and it was quite a nice little get for local people who had not met him, the first opportunity to meet him. And then he came to every San Diego convention that he could go to. Once or twice he didn't come. He announced beforehand that he didn't, but he continued to come to the convention for many, many years.
And he always acted like he didn't quite remember any of us.
Yeah.
And he wasn't being that wasn't snotty, but Forey always was kind of like he was, that sense of wonder had kind of eaten his head somehow. You could tell
I'm
he
worried my
kind
brain
of
over
was,
there.
but didn't really know it.
Yes.
It was kind of a generic Forey for us.
Yeah.
So, hey, Greg, could you talk a little bit about our initial forays into science fiction as a part of our Comic-Con? We had Ray Forey actually got us a event vote, and you were on the panel with Ken Kruger that moderated our first science fiction panel.
See, I don't really remember too much of that at all. All the conventions kind of merged together, and I feel kind of guilty because I don't remember what I was doing for Comic-Con back then, but I strongly suspect that it was that role, kind of, getting the science fiction side together, and I would sit in complete admiration of all these artists who could just draw rings around me, and we realized, okay, I don't want to be a comic artist. But the science fiction side of Comic-Con was largely that of Ray Bradbury and Forey and the people that Forey could bring in, and a few fans who covered the entire field. I think everyone on this panel was also a major science fiction fan and could converse intelligently about all of that. From the very beginning, Comic-Con was diverse. And that was at the design phase, I think, coming from the Triple Fanfare, as I understand it. And so it's great fun now to listen to comic artists saying, let's go back to the days when Comic-Con was about comics.
Yes.
It never was, entirely about comics. There were complaints from comic artists, what's all this science fiction crap going over? And then the science fiction people say, what's all this comic crap going over? And that energy has always been there for us, and I think it's really really a good demonstration of what's going on here. But the first conventions I remember were running into artists and seeing the pulp displays of Black Cat magazine, all 10 issues on one table. Oh my God, you know, you can get all 10 issues for $10. I couldn't afford it. But, or the art displays. It was just this constant blur for me. And it wasn't just Comic-Cons. It was like an Equicon at the El Cortez too that I merged with this in my mind, where I got to up in the famous El Cortez Sky Room, or whatever it was called, to get to meet George Powell and Michael Miner and all these folks. And for me, I was a fan of nearly everything. I wasn't an in-depth fan on comics, but I was a huge in-depth fan on movies and artwork and illustration and science fiction and science. And so Roger and I were just natural. I first met Roger, in fact, at Pershing Junior High School, back about 1965 or thereabouts.
This one's Pershing?
Yeah. Were you at Pershing?
No, yeah, Pershing, but I ended up at Patrick Henry. You guys ended up at
We ended up at Crawford. Yeah, you got split away. If I'd gone to Patrick Henry, I probably wouldn't be in this group.
No, wait a minute, but I infiltrated from Patrick Henry.
Okay, so you were one of those, yeah. So it was the whole San Diego dispersal thing of students. We send them here and send them there to break up the energy level. You know, it didn't work. We all got back together anyway. Met Scott Shaw at Horace Mann. Where's Scott? There you go.
Yeah.
And you know, just to find people that you can talk seriously about science fiction with. So Scott and I's early arguments involved who was better, H.G. Wells or Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I think ultimately we come out about even on that. But then David Clark in San Diego, Crawford High School, and before that around various events. David was the man about town. He was the one who was always there doing something, and you could see him. He was always prominent, always connecting, and always interconnecting people. So he interconnected me with Phil Tippett and got me in to see Ray Bradbury at the San Diego Auditorium when Ray was down here. And the rest of that just kind of folds into what eventually became Comic-Con.
That's because his mom was always willing to give him a ride.
That's right.
In fact, she was the one that drove us to see Forey.
Well, we were this other cluster, as Mike was talking about, the group that started at Comic-Con. And we were in, Shell came to one of our meetings in Ocean Beach. We met at Ken Kruger's bookstore during the summertime. And Shell came down as a guest and was introduced, and he told us this idea that they had and suggested that we come to a meeting to discuss that. And we went up, was it Bill Lund's? I think it was maybe at Bill Lund's place.
Bill Lund's was living out at the Navy base.
Who was it? Claremont? Maybe was it?
Shell was it?
That was Shell.
Was that Shell's apartment? Anyway, we all went to this. We all went up to this apartment in Claremont, and the two groups got together for the first.
I think I was there because I remember meeting Jack Kirby early on at one of these things, and I can't quite pin down which meeting it was because we did so many committee meetings over the years, and they all were together for me. So having your memory here is to refresh mine is fabulous.
Excuse me, the thing I remember the most was that I worked at Fashions Valley down here was brand new, and I got a job at the B. Dalton Bookseller. And I was impressed with B. Dalton Bookseller because they had a big display in the front window in a normal shopping mall of the Grove Press edition of I Am Curious Yellow, which was an incredibly controversial movie because it wasn't really a porno movie, but it did have explicit sex in it. And I thought, gee, I've never seen explicit sex. And I'd like to work there. I was like 16 at the time, I think.
At that point, Scott had always eaten implicit sex.
I met Bob Sork there. Bob Sork came in and he was looking for those children's books that were essentially edited reprints of Hal Foster's Prince Valiant with some added copy in them. And so we started talking, and I said, well, you like comics? And yeah, I like comics. Do you like comics? I said, hell, I want to write and draw comics. And he said, well, we have a group of people that you might like to meet. And I came out to one of those meetings, and Shell was showing a slideshow of old comic book covers. And Shell was very obviously, very proud of being kind of the guy that had the most knowledge and experience. And I remember he was showing a copy cover of More Fun Comics, and I said, oh yeah, Spectre was created by Bernard Bailey. And he kind of looked at me like, somebody else here knows that stuff? And that's when I went because they didn't know the Kruger story even existed. I found it, not like I discovered it, but it was near Cal Western where I was going to school, and I was, the first week or two, I was going to the nearest community possible, which was downtown Ocean Beach. And I went in, and here was this place that I couldn't tell what kind of a shop it was, but he had a ton of science fiction. He also had a big candle sitting on top of the shelf that was shaped like the world's biggest penis. And there was this is so Ken, there was a little 3x5 card taped to it that said, "Yes, it's a candle." And that's when we all started kind of hanging out with Ken. And then I came, that's also about the time I met Bob Sork, and I said, "Hey, there's another group of fans here," and I don't remember the convention even being mentioned when I went to the meeting, but I do know that it was brewing, and we kind of, it was like watching a film running backwards of amoebas splitting.
Yes, these groups of people. I mean, Kevin McClary and I used to buy books from Ken Kruger mail order from New York.
And John Hall.
And he said in his last newsletter, his last catalog, he said, "I'm moving to San Diego." And then you told me about the shop.
So it's really like a slime mold because it keeps coming together and splitting apart and coming back together again. So we are the San Diego slime mold.
And I influential force of people here, we did it without the internet. Isn't that amazing?
We did have, I see, the difference thing, back in those days, you must understand that guys would spend hours on the phone talking to each other about science fiction. How weird and, non-streamlined is that?
Yeah,
that's what we did.
We should have been spending the time talking to girls on the phone.
And we didn't learn about that until a couple of weeks later. But the whole point of all of this is we merged, found each other, went off. Dave and Scott and I went off to Baycon and on a bus together and irritated each other vastly, and then came back and got back together again, and then managed to get to Comic-Con. Back and forth, interconnecting all over San Diego. Eventually, all of us knew each other because of those. What would you say in internet theory, network theory? Connections, ley lines, whatever. Nodes. We were all nodes in the network of the slime mold of San Diego. So we were fruiting bodies in the network.
Prototype internet.
Yes, right, prototypical. Fanzines were part of the internet back then. We were all working on fanzines. So I know I was there because I had my illustrations of these things. And you pull up the mythographical or
Mr. Alfonso's Mr. Coggerful, 2 issues. Everyone is up here, I think, is on like it's in there.
And
I managed to catch us all.
Dave Stevens has an illustration in there.
I
I have an
Dave was the only
illustration.
one here that wasn't. Dave was also in your fanzine train of thought, wasn't he?
No, he was in Bob Sork to Destiny.
Oh, that's the
He
one.
did the cover of, actually it was like an early Rocketeer.
Somebody was asking me earlier, it's like, what was the first printed work of Dave's? And I said, well, the Quack comic that I did, Dave helped me out on quite a bit, but I think the real first print stuff was in those fanzines.
He's in Mr. Coggerful. He's got a 2-page in number 3 and a cover number 2.
Yeah.
So we kind of got to figure out years here because I meet you 65, I meet Scott at the same time, I meet Dave about 66, 67, and then we're all kind of merging in. 67 is meeting Bradbury and all that sort of stuff. But these years run by so fast, and then it's like 3 years later there's Comic-Con. That's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of interconnections and a lot of meetings, and by 1972, it's getting even more complex. We're all off to college or Vietnam or off to get physics degrees or whatever, or go work in television. Mark was professionally working even before that time, weren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, so you were probably the first professionally employed person here.
And I'll be the last, too.
I was actually the first, but because I graduated from college in '68, and I was working in book publishing in '69.
There you go.
So,
Yeah.
But I wasn't working in comics.
So how did you feel about all these punk-faced kids wandering around?
I didn't pay any attention to them. I was there to, see Jack Kirby and Ray Bradbury and things like that. But I ran across in the 1975 souvenir book with Will Eisner cover, which, Scott, were you the one that colored that?
Yeah, I had a lot of markers, so I wanted to use them all.
Anyway, Richard Butner in his
We had two guests. We had Mike Royer, who was at the time, I think, inking Tarzan for Russ Manning. Is that correct? He was doing that. And also we had another very famous guest, and who was very good to us in the very beginning and supported Comic-Con throughout the years, and you wrote about him for the program. Would you like to say
Right,
about
yeah,
that?
Forrest J. Ackerman, fan extraordinaire, editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland, and, just for Famous Monsters.
Beyond Disentanglement. To neglect any of them would be an injustice not only to the field ignored, but to its sister fields. So that's then. And then I'm looking at the 1999 souvenir book. So this is the 30th annual, and John Rogers wrote his president's message. And this was when we were already in the new convention center where we are now. But he says, sometimes it's difficult to believe that Comic-Con has been around for 30 years now. What started as a small group of comics, SF, and movie enthusiasts has now grown into the largest comic book and popular arts convention of its kind in North America. As the attendance continues to grow each year, we welcome old friends and make new ones. When Comic-Con moved into the new convention center in its first year of operation back in '91, it seemed as if we'd never be able to fill the halls. Now the space is too limiting, and we anxiously await the expansion currently under construction. Perhaps in another 30 years, another president will be writing this same message, lamenting the lack of space for the largest convention of its type. So, nothing's new under the sun as far as Comic-Con is
That'll be
concerned.
in TARDIS Hall, which covers miles 30,000 to 79 million. So.
Actually, somebody came up with the idea that they didn't need to change a thing, but instead they've gone in the membership, no fat guys. There'll be a lot more room in that room.
They can have a lot more room in that hall if they limited the size of the giveaway bags.
Nothing bigger than a square acre.
That's right, yeah. It was, I think, the first one of the El Cortez, or maybe the second one. Shell took me to lunch with Frank Capra.
Yeah.
1974.
74, yeah. I went to lunch with Frank Capra. Now that's not science fiction. That's not comic books anyway. I don't think Frank Capra ever read a comic book in his life. That's movies. And it doesn't get any more movies than Frank Capra, And it was always like that. I think one of the things people forget about when they were complaining about, well, it's not about comics anymore. Well, newsflash, comics isn't about comics anymore. There's nothing about comics at the Marvel booth. I mean, the industry has changed, whether we like it or not. The industry now, Marvel is a company that produces movies. And oh, by the way, they've got a comic book division. Right. And the change in the comic convention is the same change. There's movies and TV and animation, but there is a comic book program there. There's a very wonderful comic program there. I'll tell you my pet peeve about we've always got doing all these panels at the Comic-Con. Here's my annoyance. It's just the guy who comes up to me at the convention and says, "There's not enough here about comics. I want to hear about the old days of comics." And I say, "Well, I did a panel this afternoon with the only 3 guys left who drew Batman in the 40s. Where were you?" He said, "I was in line for the Lost panel." That's a true story.
3 or 4 years ago, I had the experience of standing in line for a big media thing and having the door closed on my face just because the last person standing outside when the hall was locked. And now that didn't bother me for just a short time. I looked at the program book and I realized that there was a whole track of really great programming in the smaller rooms, things like on the history of fandom and old comics and stuff that I love, that there was not going to be a line. I could walk right in, I could sit right down, see and hear everything, and maybe talk with people after the panel. And since that time, when I have to go to Comic-Con, my focus is on those smaller scale events. Just as we were having this smaller scale event here, I think the size of Comic-Con is great, and it's great that all those things are there, but there is a smaller scale convention if you want to go to it.
There's
There's a bunch of smaller scale conventions.
Yes.
any convention you want to attend is in that hall someplace. You just got to do a little event. It's like going to Disneyland. You can't just walk into Disneyland and find anything you want to do. You got to get a tour guide before it, a travel guide before it, and make a list. If you go to Comic-Con now, you've got to look at the program guide in advance, make a list of what you want to see, make a list of what you'll go see if you can't get into that, jot down the dealer tables that you want to go visit, and it's wonderful if you do that.
So Roger, I wanted to ask about the second Comic-Con. Was at an unusual venue that's never been at a similar place since, and you had some involvement in that.
Let's see, now you're referring to the one at UC San Diego.
UC San Diego.
And that one I'm completely innocent because I actually have documents showing that I was out of the country at the time. so I'm completely innocent on that one. But I did want to say something about 1972 in particular. And we've been saying wonderful things about the current Comic-Con. But one thing I want to point out about the early convention, 1972 is probably the best example. Today I'm a physicist, and one thing you learn in experimental physics is when you build an apparatus to do an experiment, you want to just barely build it so it just barely works. And if you put any more effort into that, you kind of overbuilt it. That is how the comic conventions were in San Diego in the early 70s. They just barely worked. And I'll give you an illustrative example of that. One evening, I was on the con committee in 1972, and that Saturday evening, I believe, a bunch of us went out to dinner. I've forgotten exactly where. And we're looking around and saying, this convention is great. We're having a tremendous amount of fun. It's interesting. Everybody's here. Who's running the convention? And we thought, well, that's okay. Everything's probably just fine. That, of course, was the evening that the power went out at the El Cortez. And we came back and discovered that, oh my gosh, people couldn't get into this, they couldn't get into that. But it was okay. That was also, as I recall, the same convention where shark repellent got dumped into the pool of the El Cortez.
Who did that?
To tremendous effect, because in fact there was a complete absence of sharks in there.
Or anything else.
That was Terry Stroud and me, as well as the Roman candle that Jack Kirby almost lit for us.
Yeah. The boom tube.
Yeah, I gave him, I said, here, Jack, it's the boom tube. and people don't realize that Jack was just an average guy in a lot of ways. I mean, in some ways he was, thinking in multiple dimensions, but Jack grew up in the slums of New York City, and you could really see that he really wanted to light that thing, but he thought, this probably isn't the thing I should be doing here. I could see him deliberate on it. By the way, I have something that I haven't thought of in years, and when you mentioned the low point of the conventions, people saying that, I thought of the lowest point for me. Wasn't the Comic-Con, but was another little 2-day convention in Old Town that I think Ken Kruger put together. You guys remember that?
King Kong.
King Kong. And it wasn't a bad little thing. It was kind of like the dealer's room that you've got now with a few programs, but I'll never forget, it was by far the shittiest thing I'd ever seen on display at a comic convention. It was this really great display of original artwork, and there was a sign in the middle that said, "These are mine, these aren't yours, go suck it." And it was like, what kind of a fan would post something like that, especially in front of art that I think a lot of people would have liked to have lifted their leg on at that point? It's like, hey, now it's nobody's. There were a lot of little kind of satellite things that weren't really affiliated with Comic-Con, but we were trying different things to see what would work.
It was a big, even if it was small, it was a big tent.
Yeah, exactly.
So, of course, in those days, especially fandom, comic fandom especially, was a fanboy thing, and most of the females at the early conventions were moms who had to bring the kids down. But we did eventually have there was a female committee member came in. Were you the first, Wendy?
No.
There were lots of female committee members. I mean, I can look on the program books, but you know,
I
early
started-
on, Mary Henderson
Yeah, I
was
was gonna
there.
say,
Yeah, that's right. That's
Dina
right.
Kelso, Vicky
Right.
Kelso, Mohi Alsman. I mean,
Because I started
Charlene
going to,
Brinkman.
yeah, Charlene, yeah. I started going to meetings in '73, but because of things that were happening in my life, I was working at the Salk Institute as a summer science student, so I couldn't go to Comic-Con. And in '74, I was an exchange student in Guadalajara, so I couldn't go to Comic-Con. But I kept going to the meetings, and one of the reasons is sitting in this room right here. Igor, stand up. Igor Maurice Goldheim. Right there, there's Igor.
Where?
Just stand up, Igor.
Stand up, damn it.
Yeah, stand up.
He said hi earlier, and I thought, who's that guy?
No, wait a minute. Now, this is the whole thing of the infiltration. This is what happened because Barry Alfonso and Igor Goldheim knew each other, and Igor's parents moved so that he went to Patrick Henry, and you knew Bob Arndt. We were all in chemistry class together, and I read science fiction.
It was about social misfits.
Well, at Patrick Henry, there was enough room for us, so we found each other.
Social Midfits has somehow all managed to get together and know each other and organize one of the largest entertainment organizations in the world in over 30 years. I mean, that's social misfits.
On the subject of
I
having.
just want to mention, as far as Igor and Barry are concerned, the very first Comic-Con meetings I ever went to, those guys were the practical jokers. There was always sometime during the meeting that they pulled off some stunt.
They did.
Yeah, they were always, you know, doing something. To,
And documented in Mr. Copperfield, the Youth for the President thing. Yes, yes.
And lots of Sam Yorty jokes. I wanted to mention too the presence of females. When this is probably hard to understand, but back when we were fans, I mean, it wasn't that we were necessarily horny teenagers, but most of us would have given lots of money to just be able to sit and talk to a girl about the stuff we love. There just weren't many out there. And I said to my wife many times, I said, boy, and this sounds terrible, I said, where were all these women when I was a kid? She said they weren't born yet. But it's really true, and I have to say, from that point of view, I every year at the convention, I meet not only more and more girls and women who are fans, but I meet dozens of women and say teenage girls that want to be cartoonists. And that absolutely excites me because I've never been able to figure out, other than the old thing, well, it's a boys club. But Jerry Lewis aside, I think women have a better sense of humor than men. And they certainly seem to see through all this bullshit of having one guy wearing his underpants on the outside punching another guy wearing his underpants on the outside. That's why Ramona Frey was such a great cartoonist and Marie Severin. They saw through the kind of idiocy of a lot of the stuff that us guys think is really cool. And I'm just so pleased that the cartooning industry in general, and the way I really find it out is by coming to Comic-Con every year, which is like, it finally seems to be on the verge of evening out, which is in my mind a great thing. We don't need to have panels about women cartoonists anymore.
We actually have women cartoonists.
We don't need to have Trina wanting to punch out Mort Walker anymore. Which she really wanted to do at one of the early conventions. We actually had to hold her back.
The second year at the El Cortez, the dates of the San Diego Con were announced because they were well in advance, and then they were changed. They put out a press release and they did the dates, and then a week or two later, the new dates came out, changed it to the following week, and nobody knew why, or they figured rescheduled thing. And then I noticed in the newspaper on the day that it had originally been announced that the El Cortez Hotel was hosting the Miss Nude California pageant. And I went to Shell and I said, "Is that why you moved?" He said, "Yes, we couldn't be on the same day." And I thought, my God, you just missed the chance to have the greatest comic convention ever. That would be it. No, you couldn't have followed it.
Shark repellent in the pool, everybody out.
Yes.
In fact, speaking of the pool, there was lots of nude swimming parties there.
Yeah.
The El Cortez was
Way too
nice. 'cause
many.
The El Cortez didn't care what you did to it, as long as people could check into the room after you. They really remember the year that they showed Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. Scott, were you involved in?
Was I involved in, if it was illicit, I probably.
Oh, right.
They
They
had
had
Bill
this,
Richardson.
it was a midnight screening of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
Oh, yeah, that's how we paid for our rooms.
Yeah. And I
We
remember.
had Bill Richardson, who's gonna be here tonight, right, with a midnight show that follows my Oddball Comic show at 11 after the Richard Alf party, so it's definitely a night not to bring your most treasured collector's items. Yes, or children. But Billzo was somebody that I knew from junior high school, mainly because I swapped monster magazines and comics with him.
He lived in Wheaton, Maryland.
He lived in
and we
Wheaton, Maryland, and he
corresponded.
was John Pound's friend.
Handwritten, we'd have hand-drawn magazines and sent them back and forth.
Yeah, and he was kind of an isolated fanboy that once he got out here, it was like him slipping into a warm pool and peeing. Made it a little warmer. But Billzo was the big movie fan among us, probably more than any of them, and wound up, he was also an outstanding actor and musician. Some of you live here in San
He
Diego.
played
probably know
at
this.
our wedding. He was our wedding singer.
Yeah, he was my wedding singer too, only with Jan Tonneson, they
Yeah.
were the Troy Dante
Inferno.
quartet.
Jose Sinatra.
But Billzo was always coming up with great ideas, and he was a theater manager of and a projectionist, and he got us a 16mm copy of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which was a Russ Meyer movie. It was one of those movies where somebody gave Russ a pretty big budget, and it wound up not looking like a big budget movie. It looked like what if Sid and Marty Krofft directed a hippie movie with lots of oversized breasts, and co-written by Roger Ebert, and it's really one of the at the time one of the most outrageous movies I'd ever seen. And we had that, and I was working for the city schools, and I got all of the anti-drug movies we could find. And I'll never forget, we showed Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. We all used it so we could pay for our rooms. We charged like $1 a piece or something. Absolutely filled the room. Showed that at least once that night. We showed all those other films, cautionary, Sonny and Cher things, wagging their fingers at us. And when the lights finally went on at 4 a.m, Theodore Sturgeon and his wife were sitting there going, "Is that all?"
It's my happening and it's freaking
Well,
me
I
out.
remember sitting there during Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. I was sitting with Bob Clampett, and the whole thing I was sitting there going. He said, "Whisper me, like, why is she doing that?" I go, "She's a lesbian." Oh, and then you have to explain the movie to Bob Clampett. And then my recollection is that's the night that the fire alarm went off in the middle of the movie.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, it was about 3
From all the
a.m.
heat that was
That was
generated.
actually the nipple detector.
That's right. About 3 a.m., this incredible fire alarm sound starts going off. And I remember that absolutely nobody thought the hotel was on fire. They all went, "Oh, the fire alarm is going off, annoying us." Nobody ran. Yeah, and it was a very loud alarm. It was going off, and you look up in the balconies, and people in their underwear are coming out. Sometimes even of their own rooms, and most people didn't come back for the end of the movie when the alarm stopped. So the next day on panels, I prefaced every panel I was moderating with, "Okay, for those of you who didn't know, here's how Beyond the Valley of the Doll ends." I could explain the end of the movie to them.
I wish you would explain it to me.
But the El Cortez was great for that kind of stuff because they didn't really care what you did to it. You were running screaming, people were running screaming to the lobby. Management was absolutely cool with all of that. And they said we weren't even. I actually talked to one of the managers of the El Cortez and I. We just had a conversation. He said, "Oh, you aren't even close to the rowdiest group we ever had. You should see the insurance salesman, life insurance salesman."
I know one person who wasn't affiliated with the hotel did not appreciate all the rowdiness. One night, a whole bunch of us are going down the hallway, and it was most all people from San Diego and LA. And we were all equally guilty of yelling and, making weird noises and stuff. But there was one guy among us who has passed long ago, but a guy that is still, in my opinion, kind of a legend in fandom. It's a guy named Dave Gibson.
Ah,
Dave Gibson was a guy that was about as big as two of me.
He looked like a walking haystack. He was a guy that was so in love with the hippie environment and the hippie culture that the other day I wrote on Facebook, I said, this is the guy that started a 60s nostalgia store in 1972. And anyway, he wasn't any bigger or louder really than the rest of us, and we're walking and all of a sudden a door opens up, and it's Jack Kirby, kind of looked like he'd thrown on a shirt or something, and he leans out and he goes, now, we're all irritated. I think they had a baby there because I think
Jeremy.
Yeah, Jeremy was a baby, and they didn't want us waking up the baby. And like I said, there's at least a dozen of us, and he goes, "Hey, Dave, could you hold it down?" and to me, that was hilarious because it was like that was the only guy that looked like a troublemaker, and he knew Dave. But it was like, cool, we're being told to shut up by Jack Kirby.
Hey, Scott. Yeah. Harvey Kurtzman told me to shut up one time because I was banging on the door of the room next to him to get into my room.
Yeah?
Yeah, and Harvey sticks his head out and is going, what the hell's the racket out here?
Hey, I once had Harvey Kurtzman laying in my lap at Comic-Con. We did this thing that in Europe is called tack-a-tack, where it's kind of a big jam drawing, and we had a big piece of paper up, and we were all drawing on it, and we were trying to make the characters and the situations all interact. And at the end, I don't have a copy, but we had like a group photo of all the artists sitting in a row, and Harvey laid across our laps.
It's in the book. It's in the 40th anniversary book.
Oh, it's in the 40th anniversary book. Yeah, Harvey always claimed that he was the uncle of the underground comic, which I always liked. He didn't try to take credit for it like some folks I know. He just said he was like a nice uncle about it.
Hey, while we're at it, since Bob Quantified was mentioned, in the 1972 convention, you had an interesting encounter with a shirt.
Yeah, in fact, this apparently was so beloved by the Clampett family that I kind of became friends with the Clampetts, and at Bob's funeral, I mean, up on, as we went through kind of the line of the surviving family, they wanted to laugh about some of the crazy stunts that I pulled at the Comic-Con and other things. And one of the first ones was, this was the first era of the smile button. The smiley yellow face. And it was everywhere. I did a comic book story about it. Yeah, with them attacking from outer space and subjugating mankind.
At Hunter Liggett Military Reservation, they had a tank with a smiley face painted on the turret.
Well, anyway, I made a T-shirt that was one of those unhappy, like a frowny face, except he had fangs and stuff. And I made it myself, and of course, because I'm always in good taste, it said "fuck off" on the bottom. And Bob, who I really didn't know very well, saw it, and I was wearing it in the middle of the dealer's room, walking around, and he said, "I really love that shirt. Where can I get one?" And I said, "Well, this is the only one, Bob." But I said, if you want it, it's yours. And in the middle of the dealer's room, Bob and I like both took off our shirts down to the skin, and Bob, swaggered around the convention the rest of the day wearing a "fuck off" shirt.
We honor these great artists and everything. Bob Clamp, of course, was responsible for Coal Black and the Seven Dwarfs in 1943, which we showed at Comic-Con because nowhere else would you be able to find it. It had been banned even worse than Song of the South. So I would love to see that again.
Well, I'll tell you something. It's really not a Comic-Con story, but I don't want to hijack this. I'll tell you quickly. One of our San Diego Con guests recently was Floyd Norman. Floyd was the first black artist hired at Disney Productions, and Floyd and I are very, very close friends. And he told me he and his partner Leo Sullivan, who were the first black animators to go off and form their own company, which was making educational films about black education, were nominated to be inducted into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame. And they were asked, well, who do you want to be your presenter? Well, Leo's first boss was at Snowball Productions making the Beanie and Cecil cartoons in '62 or so. And Leo worked for him. And he said, I want Bob Clampett to give us the award. So they flew Bob up there, and when Bob came out to introduce him, they didn't show Coal Black and the Seven Dwarves. I can't say that right. But they announced him, and they said, this is the director of Coal Black and the Seven Dwarves. And he got a standing ovation. Because Floyd explained this to me, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's a great cartoon, but they're cartoons that featured black characters. Like, there were Amos and Andy cartoons, and I was sitting with Floyd and Leo one day watching some, and they were just laughing like crazy. I said, these are terrible. Why are you guys laughing? And he said, and we're laughing because we're thinking about how happy we were to see some black cartoon characters when we were kids. And that's exactly the thing. Floyd actually has taken prints of Song of the South with all the Uncle Remus stories and characters, and shown him, without Disney knowing it, would show him like at black churches in LA, and they'd ask for him back because, you know, I'm sure individuals found them offensive, but in toto, most people were just like, hey, we're represented up there. And yeah, those are stereotypes, but there are stereotypes like that in every culture, in every race. So
I find
it's
that more fun.
that stuff is, you know, it carries this onus of being banned, but I gotta tell you, Floyd has told me that it is absolutely based on a false impression of people being offended by this stuff. But I love the fact that Bob got a standing ovation.
You had actually kind of a similar encounter with another famous cartoonist over a similarly questionable bit of cartooning.
Yeah, I don't need it. Again, I'll keep it short, but I was starting to do underground comics at the time, and Jack told me how much he loved underground comics. Now, I didn't understand that Jack was saying this figuratively rather than literally. It wasn't like Jack had a collection of Captain Piss-Guns and his pervert pirates back in the bathroom or something. But Jack loved the idea of individuals doing their own characters and printing their own comics and owning the rights to them, because Jack felt that was very important. Well, I didn't take that home with me. I just thought Jack liked weird stuff. So a friend of mine, should I say who? The man sitting next to me here, the man that's responsible for this wonderful get-together, thought that it would be great if I did this poster, and he printed them up, and it was a takeoff on, for those of you that ever collected the pre-hero Marvel monster comics, there was an issue of Strange Tales. It features this kind of weird-looking biped bulldog alien, and he's standing in the middle of an arena, and he's saying, "Puny humans, your world is doomed, for no human can beat me." So I duplicated it as faithfully as I could, including the Ditko inks. Drew the crowd in the arena, put myself in the foreground in the arena, wrote on the bottom, "This is dedicated to Jack Kirby." And I redrew it, except I added something. Now the alien in Deranged Tales is saying, "Puny humans, your world is doomed, for no human can beat me off." And he had a penis, highly erect, big veins sticking out of it. There was at least as big, if not bigger than him, and completely erect. And once we printed this up, I took it up and tried to give it to Jack. It was like 11 by 17, black and white, zip-a-tone. I mean, I knocked myself out. Poor Mike was just as deluded because he financed the whole thing. And I went up and I said, "Jack, this is for you." And Jack always wanted to kind of make a good impression, and he never wanted to say anything negative. He always kind of understood that whatever we said would be important to us, whatever he said. And I've never seen him at a loss for words like that before or since. And he goes, "I've got a family." He says, I can't put that up in my house. And I swear, I wasn't being a wise guy. I said, "But you could hang it in a closet." And Jackie's not laughing, she's shaking her head like, this isn't the assholes panel, is it?
That's it. Scott's famous Ithaphalosaur painting. It's a dinosaur painting.
That's right. Well, anyway,
And yet,
the upshot of this is it's a tribute to Jack and Ross Kirby that they didn't get some sort of police restraining order against me.
I can't take it. Scott has offended me. Probably I have to leave.
Oh. It worked.
It's wonderful to be on this. I gotta go do
Oh,
another.
he really does. Oh, okay. Well. Oh, good. Put it on. Make it stand for me. A good one. But the upshot of this is, Jack was not just a nice man, but I think he really got the fact that I was out of control because I just loved this stuff so much. I wasn't trying to offend him, and I figured, well, he's seen this kind of stuff, and it was in honor of him because it was taken from one of his covers. But, that's kind of almost when we became closer. It wasn't like I was hanging out at Jack's all the time, but I went up there many, many times, got invited to family functions, and I remember one time Jack said, boy, I was worried about you at one time, but now you're singing with the choir.
Yeah, Jack was supportive, not just of Scott, but of everybody to some extent. I don't think he ever discouraged anybody, unless I started talking about this on the Dave Stevens panel a few minutes ago. But he, you could bring the worst work in the world to Jack, and he'd find something nice to say about it, unless it was lazy or derivative. If you had made an honest effort and expressed yourself, however perverted it was or however primitive it was, he'd encourage people. And he loved the convention for that reason. He loved standing, and he would always stand, if you remember. Jack would always stand up to talk, because you were standing. He wouldn't sit down at the table and have you stand. He would stand up, and he would talk. He would talk to anybody all day about anything. You could go up to him talking about anything. You could just go talk about the news and he would talk to you about it. And he loved all these people. The reservation he had about encouraging someone like Scott or John Pound or Dave Stevens or Wendy Peeney was that he didn't feel comic books at that point were a good industry to make a living in, and that you should, if you could do something else, you should. So he didn't really encourage anybody to go ink for Marvel, but he encouraged people to express themselves and to create things. And he loved the fact that the convention was full of people who wanted to write and draw. And Scott was one of them, and he was very pleased with how that Scott, started making a living doing it and doing his own cartooning. And he was, the No Human Can Beat Me Off poster. He liked that on its own level. He just didn't know what to do with it. Because we had when we were doing the New Gods book, there were these two girls who would send in photos. Polaroids of themselves naked reading New Gods with their legs spread, the comics in front of their faces. And Jack would look at these photos and go, "No, these are fans." and he was, they were named Maxine and Alice, and it's one of the letter pages of Forever People, something like that. Steve and I put in and a special thank you to Max and Alice, a couple of swell girls. And that was a reference to the fact that they would always write, "Your comics make us swollen." And anyway, so Jeff thought it was great. But he took, every time the photos came, he showed them to Steve and me, and then he'd burn them. Because he had daughters in the house, and you can't have naked pictures. Although he had Playboy all over the studio, too. He was making collages out of Playboy. But Jack is the guy who saw where the comic convention was going before anybody else did. He's the guy who years ago said, and this is almost a direct quote, "This is going to be the place where Hollywood comes every year to sell the movies they made last year and to find out what they're going to make next year." And we all kind of went, "Yeah, Jack, sure," because at that point to us, the convention was a place to find out what Marvel was publishing next month, and And sure enough, now it's the place where Hollywood comes to show the movies they made last year and find it. It is exactly what he said. I'm pretty sure I remember him saying, "And we're going to take over the entire town. San Diego will be one big Comic-Con."
That's all in that 1970s interview that is on Comic-Con Memory. That's the website, Comic-Con Memories. So if you haven't been there yet, there's audio from the first Comic-Con of Jack Kirby talking, of Ray Bradbury talking, I think Shell interviewing Forey Ackerman. But the Kirby thing is so
Prescient.
he just predicted everything. And
They ought to run that as the cover, just that snippet on the cover of a program book sometime to remind everybody that this was what Jack figured it would be, and to quit whining about Hollywood.
And to remind a lot of kids who Jack Kirby is.
Absolutely.
And Jack, the other thing that is interesting about Jack was, to Jack, comics were not just those things on newsprint. Jack saw animation as comics, movies as comics, dance as comics. To him, comics was not limited to paper stuff. It was a way of storytelling. It was an energy. It was energized storytelling. And you look around, and by his definition, the convention is still all about comics. They're just not on paper anymore.
So, Jackie, were you at the original MiniCon? Or
no,
the first 3-day con?
my first one was the 3-day one, which was weirdly Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Did you know we had cons that were 5 days and 6 days long in the 70s?
All that coke floating around.
Yeah. Well, and other kinds of substances that people like George Clayton Johnson were liking. But yeah, I saw an ad somewhere, I guess, for the first convention, and I was married at the time to Davey Estrada, and we were comics fans, and I was an adult, married, working college graduate. I wasn't, I'm older than everybody here. So I was just went as a fan because I saw Jack Kirby's going to be there, Ray Bradbury's going to be there, and there were, some guys kind of looking at me like, what are you doing here? But pretty much I was just there, and it was a natural thing, and I only went for one day. I didn't go for the whole thing, and the UCSD one I went for one day, but then for every convention after that, I've been to all days of all of them. So,
how did you get involved actually taking a part in putting the convention on?
I was doing freelance writing, and I have a journalism degree. And one of the things that I wanted to do was magazine article writing, and I had sold a lot of magazine articles to various places, including an article about Bert Bloom's Cherokee Bookstore comics to Grit, the family newspaper. And so I came up with an idea to do an article about Comic-Con for Rolling Stone, and I had actually submitted a proposal to Rolling Stone, and the editor had said, yes, we would like to see that. So I got in touch with Richard Butner about, wanting to interview, and he said, why don't you just come to a Comic-Con meeting and you can see what we do there. And so I went to a meeting and I met a lot of people. I think this was 74. And meanwhile, they changed editors at Rolling Stone, and the new person had no interest whatsoever in comics, Comic-Con, anything like that. But I ended up with Jeff Gelb being the co-PR coordinators, and then the next year I helped shell out on the souvenir book, and then the rest is history. I've been involved ever since.
And if you come back here in an hour after this panel, I'll be interviewing Jackie about all this, and we'll continue this story.
So you must have been continually involved with Comic-Con no longer than anybody.
Gene Henderson. Gene Henderson has been involved. I think he came to the first one and he worked with Tom French starting in '71. So I think of people who are currently working on Comic-Con, Gene's the only one been there longer. And Mary. But Mary doesn't really work on the show much anymore, so.
Since we're talking about records, I can't let this moment go by.
No matter what's going on with you, I'm more messed up than you. Because I've actually been to every day of every Comic-Con since the mini-con. I tell employers when I said, there's a period where I'm just not going to be available. and I really need to get a life, but I'm not. I hope I drop dead at Comic-Con. And it's rather amazing that we haven't had any deaths at Comic-Con. Not to be morbid, but There was? Oh, the girl that walked, that ran into the traffic. That's true. I forgot about
But
that
was
because, quite
pre-planned.
frankly, the PR, the news on that kind of was like, oh, these crazy Twilight fans.
Yeah, she was a Spartan.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'm sorry that she was killed, but I'm thinking more of like old pros dropping dead and stuff, especially now that there aren't that many left. But boy, for some of those poor folks navigating the rooms, the crowds just even get to their spotlight or something must be really daunting for most of them. At least this Murphy Anderson, certainly got a lot of attention, but I don't think he's in any danger of being trampled here, which is a good thing.
Well, we're running out of those guys. At the WonderCon in Anaheim, which had, about 50,000 people, something like that, 50,000 people, I horrified Marv Wolfman and Len Wein by pointing out that the three of us were the people in that room who've been in comics the longest, and which is scary. I mean, and if Murphy were here, I think I'd have the record for this convention. And I still feel like I got into comics last Tuesday. I mean, it's amazing.
And your check is still in the mail.
Yeah, your check is still in the
Oh, that's right, yes. So, and we are now, we don't have a Golden Age panel at Comic-Con anymore. There's nobody to be on it. Last year, not this year, but last year, there were 3 people in the entire convention that I knew of, I could figure out, who had been in comics before Kennedy was shot. And one of them has since passed away, Jerry Robinson. So we're down, and the other 2 were, for your information, Ruben Afraid and then Stan Lee. This last year we had a couple more than that. We had about maybe 6, but that's all we've got. We're going to see the day very soon when they'll all be gone, and we need to treasure these people while we've got them, and interview them, and honor them, and make them understand. There's some guys there's some professionals who've never been to Comic-Con. They won't come out for whatever reason, and we haven't been able to, embrace them that way. But it's something that we should be conscious of because. The torch is being passed, not the Human Torch, but the torch is being passed here. And we've reached the stage now where, somebody's going to drop dead at the convention one of these days.
But
And probably in the middle of one of my panels.
When I walk around the dealer's room, I can tell you for a fact that some of these dealers are looking to see how well I'm feeling because they want to jump on my collection as soon as possible.
Well, that's been always one of the great things about San Diego Con compared to a lot of the other conventions is that we always make an effort to bring the veterans, they're not the hot, current people doing Marvel and DC Comics. You find people and make sure they get that attention while they're still around.
Like Siegel and Schuster, remember? Comic-Con brought them.
Yeah.
And
But even people like, one of my favorite moments, is Dave Siegel still here? There was a man named Fred Gardenier. I don't know, how many people do not know who Fred Gardenier was?
Mark,
Okay.
I'd like to correct you on that. I did not get Fred Gardenier out to Comic-Con.
Okay.
I wish I did. I did try back in 1992. I met with him. 1992, I picked him up in Babylon, New York, to take him over to Craig Fleska's house to meet Vincent Sullivan. In that time period, he did not want to come to Comic-Con.
Well, he finally did.
He moved up to the San Francisco area.
He finally came to the convention. This is a guy who'd been out of comics for years and years and years. And we had him on the Golden Age panel. He was in a wheelchair. And I asked the convention, and they rushed an Inkpot award. He was a last-minute addition. I don't think it was in the program book. They rushed an Inkpot award through the process so we could give him an Inkpot award. And I had it there. And Joe Simon was out that year, and there was an Inkpot award for Joe Simon, but he didn't show up to pick it up. 1998. So they gave it to me. They gave me both Inkpot awards to present at the Golden Age panel. So we had Joe Simon up there. I think Vince Sullivan out that year, and we had Bob Haney on the panel. We had all these, Paul Norris were on the panel. A lot of guys who aren't around anymore. And Fred Gardner was sitting there, and I announced that we were going to start off before we did the panel. I said, Joe Simon, Joe was not at the Inkpot Award ceremony last night. He said, nobody told me about it. Nobody told him to be there and receive his award. So, which now they don't even give out at the ceremony. Because, can we make the ceremony an hour longer and give out the Inkpot? No, I don't know, sorry. But I presented Joe, I asked the audience, I said, last night 4,000 people were cheering everybody who got their Inkpot Award. Would you make the sound of 4,000 people who present the Inkpot Award to Joe Simon? And this group of about, I don't know, maybe we had 300 people, no 400 people, made the sound of 4,000 people cheering and screaming, and we had Tijuana complain about the noise. And Joe was very moved by this. And then I looked over at Fred Gardenier, and he said, he looked like, well, I don't get an award, I guess. I don't get anyone. I said, you think you can just show up here, Fred, and get an award? The first time you were here? And he said, well, I guess not. I said, well, I've got one for him too. Ladies and gentlemen, you make the same sound for Fred Gardenier. And the place just erupted and cheered. And Fred starts to get out of the wheelchair. And I said, you don't just step. He said, I'm standing up for this. And he makes the way over, and I'm holding up the back of his pants because he's going to fall down. I was sitting there holding up Fred Gardenier as he made the most touching speech. This guy was, about 93, 94. He had never been to a convention. He had never been to had an award in his life. His family is sitting out front crying at the happiest moment of this man's life. And he's so moved by this. Now, the Inkpot Award meant different things to different people. But what it was the fact that this man suddenly had a trophy, had something tangible for his life. It was the first time he was in front of an audience. And everyone was like weeping on this. It was one of the great things. I just realized I'm telling the story I was going to tell at the next panel I'm doing here about great things and moments that happened at the comic convention. But we give back to people this way. One of the things I love about the convention is we go to meet these great people who did comics, but we give back to them because we make them realize that they're not forgotten, and a lot of them have made their pensions doing commissions for us. And the convention has had such a wonderful public service for the comic art community, what it's meant to comics. It's the pension and the honors that the industry never gave to the people, to all these folks. It's one of the things, one of the many things I love about the comic convention. I felt I had to say it someplace in here. So.
And I have to say too, we're not going to step on your thing, but when I was handing out the Inkpots, I was amazed and so gratified by how many families would come up. Again, I mean, not just one, but over the years that I was doing it, dozens of families, because these are guys that you have to understand. We work in a room by ourselves and sit up all night or all day working stuff, and we don't really know if the stuff's connecting with an audience. And yes, exactly. But I saw for myself firsthand, because I was the presenter, a lot of these people somehow thought I was responsible for the award, and they were coming up and thanking me with their tears wet. And I think those are, not that I'm taking any credit for it all, but I saw it, and like Mark, I think those are some of the most beautiful moments of what we do. It puts all the business of comics and the business of selling old comics and all that way down the list of the best things about Comic-Con.
And if you want to follow me over to the Eaton Room, we're starting another panel over there in 2 seconds on that theme about the great moments of Comic-Con past.
So we're done with the panel now, and glad that you could all make it out and hear about the memories of Comic-Con.